Sarah, a young beautiful woman, stared at the clock, its ticking a relentless reminder of the emptiness in her life. At 32, she felt trapped. Her days were predictable, a monotonous cycle of chores and obligations. She loved her children, but the spark in her marriage had long faded. Her husband, Mark, seemed content with their routine. Dinner conversations revolved around logistics and to-do lists. Sarah craved more, yearning for the passion that had once consumed them. Each morning, Sarah woke with a familiar ache in her heart. She envied the couples she saw, laughing together, their hands reaching for each other instinctively. One afternoon, she noticed a moving truck pulling up to the house next door. A flicker of curiosity stirred within her. Later that week, she caught a glimpse of him. He was tall and athletic, with dark hair that fell carelessly across his forehead. Their eyes met briefly, igniting a spark of longing she had almost forgotten. Sarah's days fell into a predictable rhythm. She went through the motions of her routine, packing lunches, driving the children to school, her thoughts elsewhere. The house, once filled with joyous chaos, now felt oppressively quiet. She escaped into novels, losing herself in stories of passionate love affairs and daring adventures. But the books offered only temporary escape, and the weight of her own unfulfilled desires pressed down upon her. Mark was a good man, a reliable provider, a devoted father. Yet the thread that had bound them together had frayed, leaving them on opposite sides of a widening chasm. He worked long hours, burying himself in his career. Sarah craved his touch, his gaze, a simple acknowledgement of her presence. In the evenings, they would sit together in the living room, the flickering light of the television casting an eerie glow on their faces. The silence between them spoke volumes, heavy with unspoken words and unfulfilled desires. One evening, as Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, her gaze drifted towards the window. A moving van was parked in the driveway next door, revealing a jumble of furniture and boxes. A flicker of curiosity, a welcome distraction from her own discontentment, stirred within Sarah. A new neighbor. Perhaps this would inject some much-needed life into their quiet cul-de-sac. Little did she know that the arrival of this stranger would soon turn her world upside down. Days turned into weeks, and the moving van disappeared from the driveway next door. Sarah found herself stealing glances out the window, curious about the new occupant. One sunny afternoon, she saw him standing on his back porch. He wore faded jeans and a worn t-shirt, accentuating his lean, muscular build. He moved with an easy grace, a quiet confidence that drew her eye. As he bent down to pick up a stray gardening tool, their eyes met across the expanse of their yards. His gaze was intense, and Sarah felt a jolt of something unexpected course through her. Flustered, Sarah averted her gaze, her cheeks burning. She busied herself with her son, pushing him higher on the swing, her heart pounding. She could feel his eyes on her, and she dared not look back. A few minutes later, she gathered her courage and stole another glance. He was still standing there, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He raised his hand in a small, hesitant wave, and Sarah found herself returning the gesture. The encounter, though brief, left her feeling shaken. That evening, as she prepared dinner, her thoughts kept returning to the man next door. The following day, Sarah found herself making excuses to go outside. She weeded her flower beds, her eyes scanning the yard next door. As dusk settled, she stood on her front porch, collecting the day's mail. She heard a car pull into the driveway next door, and her heart skipped a beat. He was getting out of his car, his movements fluid and graceful. "Hi," he said, his voice deep and resonant, sending a shiver down her spine. "Yes," Sarah managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm Sarah. And you are?" "Ethan," he replied, his lips curving into a slow smile. Their conversation was brief, a simple exchange of pleasantries. Yet Sarah felt an undeniable connection to this man. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself increasingly aware of Ethan's presence next door. Each glimpse fueled the flames of her fascination, a dangerous mix of curiosity and desire. Ethan seemed to share her unspoken interest. He always made a point of saying hello, his eyes lingering on hers a beat too long. Their conversations, though still innocent on the surface, were laced with a subtle undercurrent of tension. Sarah found herself replaying their conversations in her head, savoring his words. The guilt gnawed at her conscience. She tried to push Ethan from her mind, but her resolve crumbled with each stolen glance. At night, lying beside her sleeping husband, Sarah felt a world away. Mark's presence, once a source of comfort, now felt suffocating. The distance between them had grown into a chasm. She longed to confide in someone, but the weight of her secret kept her silent. Her friends wouldn't understand the suffocating monotony of her life. She was trapped, caught between the life she had and the life she craved. The air crackled with unspoken tension as Ethan held Sarah's gaze. They stood on her front porch, the remnants of a summer storm swirling around them. "Come on," Ethan said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Let's get out of this weather." He gestured towards his house, the windows glowing warm and inviting. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Just for a minute," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Inside, Ethan's house was a haven of warmth and light. The scent of cinnamon and wood smoke hung in the air. He handed her a mug of steaming tea, his fingers brushing hers. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. "You're beautiful, Sarah," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, a wave of longing washing over her. In that moment, all her carefully constructed walls crumbled. The years of suppressed desires, the guilt, the fear, it all melted away under the heat of his gaze. She had tried to fight it, to deny the pull she felt towards this man, but it was no use. She was in too deep. His lips brushed against hers, hesitant at first, then with a growing hunger that mirrored her own. The kiss was electric, igniting a fire within her that she had forgotten existed. She clung to him, her fingers tangled in his hair, her body molding against his as if they were two halves of a whole. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, caught in a whirlwind of passion and longing. She had never felt so alive, so desired, so utterly consumed by another human being. In that moment, she knew she had crossed a line, a point of no return, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't care. Sarah and Ethan's affair became a whirlwind of stolen moments and hidden desires. Their encounters were passionate, urgent, fueled by the knowledge that their time together was borrowed, precious. They met in secret, their lives a delicate dance of alibis and near misses. A secluded corner of the park, a hidden bend in the river road, Ethan's house in the quiet hours when the world slept. These became their sanctuaries, places where they could shed their everyday skins and be truly themselves. Sarah had never felt so alive, so desired, so utterly free. Ethan awakened a sensuality within her that she had forgotten existed, a wildness that both thrilled and terrified her. He saw past the mask of dutiful wife and mother, past the years of quiet desperation, and recognized the woman she longed to be. In his arms, she found a refuge from the predictability of her life, the suffocating routines, the unspoken disappointments. Their conversations were easy, unguarded, filled with laughter and a shared understanding that transcended words. For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt truly seen, truly known. But the thrill of their forbidden love affair was inextricably intertwined with the weight of her deception. Sarah lived a double life, her days a carefully constructed facade that hid the truth of her nights. She became a master of disguise, her smiles masking the guilt that gnawed at her conscience, her words carefully chosen to deflect suspicion. The lies, once foreign to her lips, became easier with practice, slipping out with a casualness that chilled her to the core. She lied to her husband, her friends, her children, the people she loved most in the world. Each lie was a betrayal, a crack in the foundation of the life she had built. The guilt manifested itself in unexpected ways. She found herself snapping at her children, withdrawing from her friends, unable to meet their eyes without feeling the weight of her secret. She became hypervigilant, constantly on edge, terrified of being caught, of her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The strain of living a double life began to take its toll. Sarah's once bright eyes lost their sparkle, replaced by a haunted look that spoke of sleepless nights and a troubled conscience. She lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame, a visible reminder of the turmoil that raged within her. Mark noticed, of course. He couldn't help but notice the changes in his wife, the distance that had grown between them. He questioned her, his voice laced with concern, but she brushed off his worries, attributing her behavior to stress, fatigue, anything but the truth. His questions, though well-intentioned, only served to heighten her guilt and fear. She recoiled from his touch, his attempts at intimacy feeling like a betrayal of the passion she found in Ethan's arms. The chasm between them, once a subtle divide, had become a gaping abyss, threatening to swallow them both whole. The phone hummed on the coffee table, a persistent reminder of the impossible situation Sarah found herself in. The caller ID displayed Ethan, the single word sending a familiar shiver down her spine, but it was the second missed call, the one flashing silently beneath, that held her captive. Mark. Her life had become a tangled web of deceit, and the threads were starting to unravel. The guilt that had gnawed at her conscience now roared, a relentless fire threatening to consume the fragile remnants of her life. The stolen moments with Ethan, once a source of intoxicating freedom, now felt like poisoned apples, their sweetness laced with the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. The life she had built, the life she had once cherished, felt like a house of cards, teetering precariously on the edge of collapse. Her husband, her children, their innocent faces filled with unconditional love, were casualties in a war she had waged against her own happiness, her own desires. Sarah closed her eyes, each inhale a shallow grasp for air in a room that seemed to shrink with every passing second. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, suffocating. How had she let it get this far? How had she, a woman who prided herself on her loyalty, her morals, become someone she barely recognized? The silence of the house, usually a comforting presence, was now deafening, amplifying the turmoil that raged within her. Every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock seemed to whisper accusations, reminders of the life she was jeopardizing. She had to make a choice. Stay with Mark, the man who had been her constant for so long, the father of her children, and try to rekindle a flame that had long since dwindled to embers, or abandon the life she had built, risk the judgment of her friends and family, for the intoxicating, uncertain promise of love with Ethan. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah, heavy and suffocating. Her life, once a comforting tapestry of routine and obligation, had unraveled, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The carefully constructed walls she had erected around her heart, meant to protect and shield, now felt like a prison of her own making. She had sought solace in Ethan's arms, a temporary escape from the quiet desperation of her marriage. But the thrill of their forbidden love affair had faded, replaced by the bitter aftertaste of betrayal and the crushing weight of her choices. The laughter, the whispered secrets, the stolen kisses, they all felt tainted now, poisoned by the knowledge of the pain she had inflicted. The phone continued to hum, a relentless reminder of the two paths that stretched before her. Two men, two versions of love, two vastly different futures. Could she find her way back to the comfort of familiarity, to the man who had been her constant for so long? Or had the fire of passion once ignited, burned too brightly to be extinguished? In the end, the decision would be hers and hers alone. A choice that would shape not only her own destiny, but the lives of those she held most dear. And as she stared out at the twilight, the sky ablaze with the colors of a setting sun, Sarah knew that some choices once made could never be undone.